If the Neolithic ushered a bunch of new stuff, like domestication, agriculture, permanent settlements, etc., which profoundly affected human activity and experience in Greece, then the early Bronze Age took all of them and tested their limits in various ways. It is a truly fascinating era, and I hope you agree with me by the end of this lecture. Before we embark on our journey, let me introduce you to an alphabet soup. So, we have no idea whether people in the Aegean spoke the same language or identified themselves as Helladics and Cycladics or Minoans. Nevertheless, archaeologists, based on geographical areas and material culture prevalent in those areas, they have defined three domains: the Helladic, the Cycladic, and the Minoan. Based on these geographical and cultural designations, archaeologists have developed a chronological system that looks like this. So, the system has three subdivisions, right? One, two, three with Latin letters, and those subdivisions are further subdivided into another two or three subdivisions marked with the letter of the alphabet. I know that this is pretty confusing, especially to the first time Greek archaeology student, but bear with me. I'm going to try to not confuse you too much with all of this. The absolute chronological ranges are pretty much the same, more or less. So the EB1, right? So early Bronze Age or early Helladic 1 or early Minoan 1 or early Cycladic 1 goes from 3200 down to 2700 BCE, followed by the early Bronze Age 2 or early Helladic, early Minoan, early Cycladic 2 from 2700 down to 2200, followed by the EB3 from 2200 down to 2000. The two trends that started in the Neolithic, i.e., colonization and concentration of settlement in coastal and island areas, as well as an increase in population, continues unabated in the beginning of the early Bronze Age. The settlement pattern that characterizes the final Neolithic and the early Bronze Age is a dispersed settlement pattern. That means that people preferred to live in scattered and separate farmsteads of hamlets instead of nucleated towns or villages. So, in the beginning of the early Bronze Age, there's no village to speak of, but a few of the settlements grow into village size in the early Bronze Age, the second period, EB2, which means that one could find in the landscape a settlement hierarchy of two or three levels. But what is this settlement hierarchy that you've probably encountered this term in your textbook, Bentliff, a few times so far. Settlement hierarchy is a way to categorize and order settlements based on their population and a couple of other criteria. This is a term that is used and a framework that is used by landscape historians, geographers, and of course archaeologists, especially the ones who study the landscape through surface surveys. In early Bronze Age too, surface surveys show us that there are two or three levels, which means that the landscape was littered with farmsteads or individual dwellings having 1 to 10 inhabitants, and then less hamlets numbering anywhere from 10 to 100 people, and with the very fewer concentrations of people in a handful of villages, if there were any. But since we don't have people, how do archaeologists get to these designations? Well, the size of the settlement, of course. Most settlements that have been located by surface surveys are anywhere from 1 to 3 hectares, and some, few, Very few, more than 8. More people means more mouths to feed. So let's see what supported this system. So let's have a look at the economy of the EBA. So in this period, um, agriculture adopts a polyculture. So the cultivation of a few things at the same time. So the polyculture in the Aegean consisted of the cultivation of the olive tree, the vine, and of course the cereals, and make up something that it's called the Mediterranean triad. More on this just a little bit. Moreover, this period is connected to a metal boom. That is an intensification in the extraction and exploitation of metals, which is of course associated also with the intensification of maritime activity and exchange. And of course, this increased economic activity had two interrelated effects: the creation of surplus, and of course, the elaboration of storage systems, as well as the first system of control of the distribution of goods, i.e., administration. So let's start with the Mediterranean triad, or better, the Mediterranean quartet, as Anaya Sarpaki, a prominent paleobotanist, has suggested. So the Mediterranean quartet consists of the cultivation of wheat, barley, and etc., vine, right, grapes, and olives, and legumes like beans, lentils, veg, etc. So these four agricultural products were the basis of the diet in the Mediterranean world and the basis of something that today nutritionists call the Mediterranean um, diet, which is supposedly super good for you. Why were these appropriate for the Mediterranean climate? Why are we making such a fuss about them? Well, the climate in southern Greece and the islands is arid or semi-arid, which means it does not rain a lot, especially in the summer, which is a little bit of a problem when you want to cultivate and crops. So these plants are particularly well suited to this climate as they need uh, only a good rain or two in the spring and then can ride the dry summer, which means that farmers could spread the cultivated areas in the marginal areas with no access to a water source or high water table. So one of the byproducts of this particular combination of agricultural products is the emergence of feasting culture. We know that feasting had emerged in the previous period, the Neolithic, but now feasting shows up loud and clear in the material culture. So it shows up loud and clear with the appearance of pouring vessels, for instance, like the so-called sauce boats you can see on the left-hand side of your slide, which become the shape par excellence in this period. Or representations of drinkers and musicians like the Cycladic figurine on the right. It's a Cycladic figurine of a harpist. And even though we don't have direct evidence for this, we may surmise also the efflorescence of storytelling, with bards popping up in these gatherings, entertaining the guests with stories of adventures, heroic feats in faraway lands. Those faraway lands became a little more accessible with the intensification of maritime activity in the Aegean. Even though maritime activity in the Aegean is documented since the Neolithic, remember Frankthia, huh? And the obsidian that came from Milos. Nevertheless, the colonization of Cycladic islands in the final Neolithic and the increase of population and dispersal of sites created a network of settlements on the islands. So these settlements were connected to one another socially and economically. Cyprian Broodbank, in his 2000 book, claimed that the sea was not a separator but a connector, to the extent that sites on opposite shores were more connected than sites on different sides of the same island. And for those who could and were willing to assume the risk of maritime travel, right, especially long range maritime travel, the payoff could have been tremendous. These trading and raiding, you could say trading and slash raiding expeditions became more profitable because of another major development during this period, the metal boom. During this period, the metal sources of the Aegean start being exploited more intensively. This does not mean that metal sources were discovered in the EBA. Far from it. There is good evidence of, for instance, that Lavrion or extraction starts in the final Neolithic, right around 3200 BCE. For some reason that may have to do with technological advances in processing and smelting, sources around the Aegean are being exploited more intensively now. According to archaeometallurgical surveys, silver, lead, copper, which were used, of course, in the manufacture of the first metal objects, derived from Aegean sources on Sifnos, Kithnos, most likely on Seriphos, Syros, and of course, last but not least, Lavrion. But to make copper, you need a pretty important ingredient, tin. And there are no tin sources in the Aegean. So in this map, I show you the nearest tin sources that are located in Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, especially in the Taurus mountain range. The most plausible reconstruction of how tin reached the Cyclades in Greece was that it reached it in the form of prepared bronze alloys via the North Aegean Islands and the Troad, which explains a few things if you think about it. So it explains the prosperity of this part of the Aegean in the EBA and the wealth concentrated at a site that you might have heard of before, Troy. Troy in antiquity was on the mouth of the river Scamander and next to the mouth of the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles were, and still are, narrow straits that connect the Aegean with the Bosporus Sea and the Black Sea. Note that on this map that I'm showing you, Troy seems to be an inland site, but there is good evidence that the current shoreline was not there in antiquity, but much closer to the site, as you can see in this the second map that I put up on the slide. So the shipping routes transferring the tin and copper alloys would pass through here, and we can imagine boats beaching on the shores for a little bit of rest, replenishments of their stores, and a little trading on the side. If you have all that in mind, it comes as no surprise when you hear about the famous treasure of Troy. Around the end of the 19th century, a rich German merchant turned archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, attracted to the spot by the descriptions of the town in Homer's Iliad, started excavations at the site of Helladic. And even though his excavations were super crude by modern standards, he became a pioneer in tell archaeology and became the father of Greek archaeology as a whole. And not only that, but he also found a remarkable treasure that he thought was Priam's treasure, and Priam was the mythical king of Troy in the Iliad. Unfortunately, this treasure turned out to be more than a millennium earlier than the War of Troy, if it ever took place, right around 1200 BCE. The treasure was dated to the EBA and is a testament to the wealth of the city, or should we say, a few important people in the city who commanded most resources. And they accumulated this wealth as a consequence of the advantageous position of the settlement. By the way, if you're into stories about the vicissitudes of archaeological collections, this one is the perfect one to look into because the story involves international politics, wars, Nazis, Soviets, lost treasure, and so much more. Metals and precious items made out of metals are basically accumulated wealth and value stored in one item that can be displayed and can advertise your wealth. But the real wealth was in the land you farmed and in your storage room. How much stuff you had and how many people you could feed with your stored foodstuffs was the real measure of wealth. We saw that in the Neolithic, storage and food preparation moves gradually from communal areas to the interior of the house and from plain view to being concealed, perhaps signifying the transition from a more egalitarian community with emphasis on sharing and cooperation to communities that put their emphasis on hoarding resources on the level of household. This is this is a process that continues in the EBA, and we see the development of storage systems as well as the first attempts of administration of stored goods. Therefore, in this period in the Aegean, we witness the emergence of sealing systems, and more on that later. Surplus, administration, wealth, accumulated wealth, all of these buzzwords mean that in the EBA, sociopolitical complexity increases and the gap between the haves and have-nots becomes more pronounced. Even though society is still considered by archaeologists to be essentially trans-egalitarian, especially in communities that are small enough to require sharing of resources and cooperation, in the bigger ones that start to pop up, especially during the EB2, certain households get to distinguish themselves through conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is a term established by Forstein Veblen, and it means the ostentatious consumption of wealth or luxury goods in order to display publicly the economic power of the spender and gain prestige and enhance the social standing of the one who does the conspicuous consumption. So, conspicuous consumption is on the rise. In the mortuary sphere, conspicuous consumption meant more elaborate graves and graveside ceremonies, and of course, grave goods like jewelry and metal daggers and figurines, and so on and so forth. In the sphere of social interaction, it meant feasts and big parties, and occasional support of the community through gifts and donations. It also meant the building of more prominent buildings with 2 stories, balconies, houses otherwise known as corridor houses. Nevertheless, the ranking of these prominent households do not end up getting solidified into a social hierarchy by the end of the period. Instead, scholars think that leaders were more likely the equivalent of big men. So, the anthropological term that means a leader who does not have formal authority but leads by example, persuasion, and charisma, or even chiefs. So, leaders with true authority who are wealthier than others, right? So, where can we find these chiefs or big men? Well, we can find them all around the Aegean in village sites, right? So, um, nucleated settlements where big buildings are built, especially with big buildings that are corridor houses in the Aegean, but not on Crete. Towards the end of the EBA, the climate probably threw a curveball to most of these chiefdoms. So, in the Aegean Islands and the Greek mainland, chiefdoms do not evolve into states, but in Crete, they do graduate into the next level. But more on that next time. So during the EB3, several sites in the Aegean show evidence of widespread disruption followed by recession and depopulation that ensues. This disruption in the past was incriminated for the coming of the Greeks, but the theory has been discredited by Jeannette Forsen and Jeremy Ratter. But let's backtrack a little bit, or a lot, and let's go and look at each of these three cultural areas. Cultural within quotes, right? Starting with southern Greece and the early Helladic. Each of these phases or cultures of the early Helladic period is named after important sites of this period, or the first site that the subphase was first discovered. But we're not going to focus on the various cultures, but let's fast track our way to the early Helladic II and the site of Lerna. So the site par excellence in this period is the site of Lerna, where the famous House of Tiles was found. The site was excavated by J.L. Caskey, Jack Caskey, my academic grandfather, since he taught at the University of Cincinnati and was the advisor of my advisor, Jack Davis. Fun fact you didn't need to know per se. In 1952, and as the director of the American School of Classical Studies, he located and excavated the site of Lerna, a site that was sort of famous because of its connections to the Greek myth of the Lernaean Hydra, which was vanquished by the Greek hero Hercules or Heracles. At the site of Lerna, Kaski uncovered the remains of various phases of the site's life from the Neolithic to the early Mycenaean period. Here we're going to focus on the remains of the early Helladic period, and especially the later phases. So the remains consisted of the fortification wall with horseshoe-shaped towers that defended dual dwellings in the inside. But most importantly, large rectangular structures, the most famous of which is the House of Tiles, because of the ceramic tiles that was used to roof the structure, like this one that I'm showing you on the slide. The House of Tiles was a mud brick structure that featured rectangular spaces, as you can see on the plan, along the central axis of the building, flanked by corridors that accommodated staircases, staircases that led to the second story, which of course has not been preserved. But nevertheless, it can be reconstructed based on the architectural evidence, even though you might see a couple different iterations of it out there. So the second story probably housed living quarters for the family that lived here and a couple balconies that overlooked the surrounding area. The ground floor level probably had a more public function, especially judging from the wide entrance that gave access to the east room, which was also equipped with a clay hearth. This hearth was a pretty big one, so it was 1.15 meters or almost 4 feet in diameter, and its rim was impressed with a cylinder seal, a common feature of hearths in great houses of the period. In the center of the hearth, there was a double axe carving. This house was not only grand in its scale, right, especially compared to all the other houses around it, but also harbored other features which we equate with the presence of a chief or an important person, like, of course, evidence for administration. So the ceilings did not just mark the rim of the hearth, but also clay logs of wooden chests containing probably dry commodities. These were found in the southernmost of the two small rooms of the House of Tiles, and it was a room that actually could be accessed only from the outside of the building. And in there, The excavators found more than 150 clay ceilings bearing the impressions of some 60 seals. So, big business, right? The final phase of the early Helladic in Lerna is characterized by a destruction of the House of Tiles. Even though no structure was built on top, for unknown reasons, the area and the building itself seems to have commanded respect from the surrounding community, since the impressive pile of rubble after the destruction was turned into a tumulus, so an earthen mound that frequently covers important burials of ancestors or heroes. As for the burials of these people, they seem to show little richness or elaboration. Simple pits or stone cists predominate in the cemeteries, while the one in coastal areas seem to have an island flair, taking after Cycladic cemeteries, which we're going to examine in a little bit. The major exception in this phenomenon of minimal investment in the mortuary sphere is the so-called R graves of Lefkas, right? So tumulus burials of considerable richness, which are the beginning of a long tradition of tumulus burials in northwest Greece, Albania, and perhaps all the way to Croatia. Developments in the early Cycladic period follow a very similar trajectory to mainland Greece. Before we move on any further into the examination of the Cycladic civilization, we need to mention that the distinctive culture of the early Cycladic period, with its folded arm figurines and marble vessels, as well as the mariners that crisscrossed the Aegean, creating links that connected cultures and transported goods and ideas, attracted the attention of the most famous historian of Europe and the UK, Colin Renfrew, who dedicated his 1972 book, The Emergence of Civilization, to these remarkable people. Renfrew thought that these people, the Cycladic people, were the necessary stepping stone, right, before the emergence of state-level societies on Crete. Nevertheless, the Cyclades, much like the mainland, did not make the transition into state-level societies. Renfrew was the one who codified the various phases of the Cycladic civilization, following Gordon Child's practice in constituting cultures or units with a specific cultural and geographic extent and also chronological extent. He constituted the Grotopilos culture for EC1, the Kerosiros culture for EC2A, and the Castri group for the end of EC2, beginning of EC3. In the Cyclades, there's not a ton of evidence from settlements, but on the contrary, there is a ton of evidence from cemeteries. But let's look at the settlements first, and then let's turn our attention to the dead. So Cyprian Broodbank, who synthesized this data for the Cyclades, noted the same dispersed settlement pattern as on the mainland. That is, a lot of farmsteads, less hamlets, and on some islands, there emerged villages in EC2. Those villages were Castri on Syros, Aierini on Kea, Skarkos on Ios, Grota on Naxos, and Daskalio on Keros. These villages, according to Broodbank, had anywhere from 100 to 300 inhabitants, and they managed to get to a happy demographic threshold that made them able to assemble enough people to man ships, especially if they solicited applications from neighboring settlements, so to speak. And when we say enough people, you may ask, how many are we talking about? Again, Cyprian Broodbank studied the representations of watercrafts on various media, but mainly on the so-called frying pans that I'm showing you here. So he suggested that these could be best described as longboats, much like the Viking longboats, but without the sail, of course, because that had not been invented yet. For that, you have to wait a few more centuries. So these longboats would be manned by 30 to 50 oarsmen, which should be all the able men, right, in a big village, and then some, if we're talking about villages of 100 to 250 people. Organizing such an expedition, getting the men and the resources together, is quite costly and could be taken as a sign of increased social complexity. Moreover, taking into consideration the range of these vessels and then representing their range as concentric circles around islands, Broadband was able to show the sequence of small worlds, right, that the Cyclades were all about. Again, as we mentioned earlier, it seems that the sea was not isolating these settlements, but connecting them, creating networks not only for trading and raiding, well, these go together, right? But also social networks made of family and friend connections that connected these small worlds together. The fact that raiding was an issue, especially towards the end of the EBA, can be seen by the increased frequency of fortified sites like Castries on Syros. So Castries is one of these fortified communities that probably buried its dead in the Halandriani cemetery on the opposite hill. Halandriani has been dated to EB2 and the site to EB3. So Syros, the island where Castries is located, was a very important node in the network of communication between the Cyclades and the western coast of Turkey. And that's reflected in its material culture. So, for instance, most representations of longboats that we have are from Syros, even though based on the reconstruction of the population on the site, based on the cemetery, Heckman suggested it was pretty small, anywhere from 75 to 100 people. Speaking of cemeteries, this is where we know most about Cycladic people, even though, again, the proportion of cemeteries that have been excavated versus looted is relatively minuscule. So, in the cemetery of Halandriani that we just mentioned, tombs occur in clusters that are thought to represent different social groups or extended families. The graves themselves are stone built cist graves, since stone is in abundance in the Cyclades. They're mostly individual graves, even though occasionally they may have multiple occupants. The dead are placed immediately on the floor or on a layer of gravel in an intensely contracted position, probably achieved by tying up the deceased before the rigor mortis set in. Their head was often made to rest on a stone used as a pillow. And as for grave goods, even though unfurnished or poorly furnished graves are not unusual, far from it, some deceased, based on their gender, age and social status, were given ceramic or marble vessels, marble figurines, more on them in a little bit, palettes and grinders, as well as bone tubes with colored substances, obsidian blades, tweezers, jewelry, as well as bronze tools and weapons. Another frequent and distinctive product of Cycladic artisans is the frying pan, which is a total misnomer because nowadays archaeologists do not think that these curious objects were ever used in cooking. Several suggestions have been made about their potential uses, including my favorite, as a mirror with the help of a little water poured in the bowl. But the most distinctive Cycladic product is by far the marble figurines, otherwise called folded arm figurines for obvious reasons, right? They have their folded arms under their breasts. These figurines actually are the reason why so many Cycladic cemeteries have been looted in search of them. These figurines are mostly female, like 95% of them, with folded arms, and were not meant to stand upright, but lie on their back. You can see that very clearly when you see the figurine, a figurine in profile. Nowadays, their appearance shows off that high quality marble that they were made out of, but the research has shown that that was not the case in antiquity. So, subjected to infrared rays, the figurines showed that they were decorated with all sorts of motifs, including eyes, etc. And some of them show vertical lines on their faces, which have been taken as evidence to suggest that they may have been mourners, since mourners in later Greek periods were known to scratch their faces as a sign of mourning. I'm not going to say anything more about this because I don't want to spoil the next reflection and the surprise. The other thing that these decorated figurines suggested is that early Cycladic people took steps to modify their body with scarification, tattooing, and the use of pigments. Sound familiar? Even though most figurines, as I said earlier, 95% of them are of the folded arm type, there are few remarkable figurines that break with tradition. Most of them are male, and they are represented in more active poses, so to speak, like playing the harp, the flute, drinking, and this situation substantiates arguments, of course, about the efflorescence of feasting culture that I mentioned earlier in the lecture, as well as the emergence of a male centered or warrior culture, especially with figurines like this one that have that are most of them are male and they have daggers. But here's the funny thing. Some of these warrior type figurines are female. In any case, much like the mainland, the Cyclades seemed to experience the same kind of disruption at the end of EC2 and the beginning of EC3. More fortified settlements and abandonment of many sites has given rise to the so-called EC3 gap theory, which is a fascinating topic, but alas, we have no time to get into it for real because we have to get to the early Minoan culture, which we left for last, but definitely not for least. The first question that you might ask is, so what's up with that Minoan thing? The other two had geographic designations, so why not Cretan? Well, so back in the day, in the beginning of the 20th century, Sir Arthur Evans, that I have here on the slide for you, the British archaeologist working for the Ashmolean Museum, he uncovered in his excavations what he thought was the Palace of Knossos. So the Palace of Knossos, according to the Greek myths, was the place and the palace of the legendary King Minos. So after King Minos, he baptized Arthur Evans the whole civilization as Minoan. So there you go. We are certainly going to talk about the Palace of Knossos, which you see here in a reconstruction, but we're going to talk about it in the lecture about the Middle Bronze Age. However, I have to mention it here because the fact that Minoan palaces emerged at the end of the EBA instead of suffering the arrested development that affected the mainland and the Cyclades. So this looms large and colors the discussion of the early Minoan period. Much like Renfrew stuck the discussion of the Cyclades in the context of the emergence of civilization, i.e., the emergence of the palaces of Crete, it is hard to consider the large architectural complexes or towns or tombs of the early Minoan without relating them to a supposed march towards the state. All right, before we plunge into the archaeology of early Minoan Crete, let's review our trusted chronological chart. So instead of early Helladic or early Cycladic, here we have early Minoan 1, 2, 2A, 2B, and early Minoan 3. Again, the absolute chronological ranges are sort of the same as the early Cycladic and early Helladic, and the sites that we're going to look at in this lecture are Agia Fotia, Myrtos, Furnu Koryphi, I know, a mouthful, and Vasiliki. So let's delve into it. On the northeastern part of Crete, excavations by Kostis Davaras uncovered a site consisting of 263 tombs that dated to the early Minoan I and early Minoan II periods. The tombs included pottery that had been considered as imports from the Cyclades, locally made pottery, obsidian, crucibles for melting copper, copper tools and weapons, and two small figurine pendants. All these finds, which were so Cycladic in many ways, have spurred archaeologists to suggest that Agia Fotia was a Cycladic colony or a gateway community that allowed easier exchange of goods and ideas between Cycladic merchants and craft specialists and the local population, of course. This exchange was by no means a one-way street, as we see another colony, that of Castrion Kythera, and this time Cretan colonists leapt to the other side and the opposite shore. But let's move on to other important settlements. Since the later palaces were an agglomeration of rooms around a wide open area, an open-air courtyard, there was a slight fixation with buildings in the early Minoan period that were centered or partly surrounded an open area, since archaeologists were trying to find the obvious and previous evolutionary step before the palaces. So both Myrtos, Furnu Koryphi, and the next site of Vasiliki were quote-unquote incriminated as being the seat of overlords, but upon closer inspection of the archaeological data showed that things were not so clear-cut. So Myrtos is a great example of this process, as well as what an archaeologist can do with good data and slightly different perspective. So Todd Whitelaw, roughly a decade after the publication of and the excavation of the site, identified not a single complex administered by a single authority as it was suggested by the excavator, but an agglomeration of 5 or 6 independent units of roughly the same size and complexity. So each of these units were dwellings, according to Whitelaw, of nuclear families of 4 to 6 people, downgrading the population estimate from 100 to 120 to perhaps a quarter of that or less. Were there leaders in this community? Absolutely, but not the hereditary leaders that would build an aristocracy and significant wealth to pump into the construction of the palaces at the end of the period. Another settlement that was identified as the house of a chieftain was the building at Vasiliki. In the middle of the narrowest part of Crete, Vasiliki commanded obviously a very strategic point in the communication network of Crete. The original excavator suggested that the building enclosed the central area on all 4 sides. Again, subsequent excavations by Zois showed that the building here was not a single building, but a few separate houses built into 2 successive stages, but with storage rooms and a large number of loomwates. Perhaps these 2 houses, so the Red House and the West House as they were subsequently named, were not parts of a primitive palace of sorts, but they were definitely worth looking at closely because of their size and complexity. As for the burial landscapes of Crete, we see that communities here did not put the focus on the individual like the Cycladic communities did or the communities of the mainland. but put the emphasis on the community or the extended family or the residential group. So, one tomb for all of them. This emphasis on the community and the erasure of individual identities after death was not a regional phenomenon on Crete, even though in different parts of Crete they chose to build tombs differently. So, for instance, house tombs like these ones, um, so tombs that pretty much resembled a house, were usual in Central and East Crete, whereas Tholos tombs were prevalent in the south central part of Crete. Of the two types, let's say a couple more things about the Tholos tomb. Tholos tombs on Crete occur in the south central part of Crete or the Messara. So these were above ground circular chambers made out of stone, and they're always found in a similar state, so without the roof. So the circular chamber was the standard, but some tombs, such as this one that you see from Camillari, had adjoining rectangular rooms and paved courtyards in front of their entrances to accommodate ritual banquets and ceremonies that communities actually hosted there pretty frequently. The dead would be deposited in the circular chamber, which was reused again and again after pushing the previous occupant of the center of the room to the side, along with his or her burial gifts. These tombs, if unlooted and excavated properly, they provide a wealth of information and burial gifts like seals, figurines, jewelry, metal tools, weapons, and so on and so forth. But alas, because of the constant disturbance of these chambers, we cannot be sure about the associations between gender and type of artifact, or who received more than the others anyway during their funeral. That's why earlier I talked about the erasure of personal identity. In death, you were literally joined with the amorphous pool of ancestors. And on that note, I'm going to bid you and the wonderful world of the early Bronze Age goodbye. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and thank you very much for your attention.